The next speaker, I believe, someone check me on this, is Dr. Ziegler, is that right? Okay, can we put her on the screen? Hi, Dr. Ziegler.
Hello, I am here. Can you all hear me?
Yes. I will, by way of brief introduction, Dr. Ziegler is at Duke. I'm sure she will tell you what the ORCA is. Through funding from the FDA in collaboration with Combined Brain, which is a excellent umbrella group that we are a part of. I am on the board of it, but nobody will disagree. It's an excellent operation. The FDA funded work through the team at Duke to expand the ORCA from Angelman to other neurodevelopmental diseases, and of course, Syngap is on that list. So we'll be hearing about that today. Having just heard from Tom, and we're about to hear from Christy, I want to reference Katie Cunin's talk earlier, saying, wow, wouldn't it be great if we had some specific Syngap measures? Well, here's two for you. Over to you, Dr. Ziegler.
Thank you so much, Mike. Well, I'm so disappointed that I'm not there with you all in Florida today, but I am very grateful to technology that allows me to beam in from my home in North Carolina. And I'm so excited to talk to you today about measuring communication ability and a project that is very relevant to this community. So I know I have a short amount of time with you all today, so I'm going to plan to give a quick overview of the ORCA measure. So ORCA stands for Observer Reported Communication Ability Measure. And then I'm going to spend most of the time on our current project. We're about halfway through a 5-year project period, as well as going over some qualitative results that are relevant to this community. And then wrapping it up with next steps. What do we still have to do to push the field forward and get closer to having measures that are fit for purpose for clinical trials? In terms of disclosures, it's important to know that I have interest in the ORCA measure. I'm also going to be talking about a project that is funded by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So some details about that funding award are here on this slide. It is also important to note that the views I express today are my own and do not necessarily represent those of my employer or the FDA. All right, so this story really starts with the ORCA measure, which was originally developed by a contract between our team at Duke and the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics. And they were looking ahead to exciting clinical trials coming down the pipeline and identifying that communication ability is one of the top priorities for families in terms of what they want to see happen within a clinical trial, improvements in communication ability. There also were limitations in existing measures for the clinical trial context, although there are a lot of really well designed and developed measures for the clinical setting, for the educational setting. So what we did is we developed a measure de novo, which means a new measure. We really grounded it in the caregiver perspective. So what parents observed in communication with their children, what was meaningful and impactful to families. We also designed it to test a broad range of communication concepts, so across expressive, receptive, and social communication. And we were very inclusive of all of the different ways that children communicate. So instead of focusing primarily on verbal speech, we also ask about gestures, sounds, eye gaze, body movements, and assistive technology. So this is the version that's out there right now. It's publicly available. It's been translated into a number of languages. So there is qualitative and quantitative support for the ORCA for children and adults with Angelman syndrome. But while we were working on this project, we were really struck by the interest from outside of the Angelman syndrome community. And like Dr. Fraser just said, communication ability comes up across the board as something that's very important to families. And knowing that we need to have specific, sensitive, reliable measures for clinical trials, which are high stakes decisions that are being made, we want to make sure that we are measuring things in a way that is meaningful and really rigorous. So that brings me to the current project. So the ultimate objective of our study is to promote the conduct of patient-centered clinical trials for kids with neurodevelopmental disorders. And we're doing that by focusing on the measurement of communication ability. And we're leveraging some of that work that we've already completed on the ORCA measure. So this project is a 5-year phased award. Up on the screen right now are the 2 aims for our initial phase, the planning phase, which was 2 years long. We have completed this phase. The first aim is really a qualitative aim. So interviews with parents, with clinicians who work with children like yours, And the goal of this is really, if we want to measure something, we have to be able to define it. We have to be able to describe it. And we want to really anchor any measurement of communication ability in the family experiences. So what are the aspects of communication that are most meaningful to parents and families? The second aim was really a synthesis aim, taking the qualitative work, taking what we know in the literature, what is being done by other groups, and making a plan. What do we need to do to get closer to having fit for purpose measures for clinical trials? And fit for purpose just means that everybody agrees that there is enough evidence that to support that we can use them to make reasonable claims about a medication. All right, so I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about our caregiver interviews. Our interviews really had two parts. So there were two major components to the interviews. The first major component was describing communication. So this was open-ended questions that we posed to parents. How do you communicate with your child? What do you notice? How has that changed as your child has grown? And what would be really meaningful to you in the context of a clinical trial? Since we already had a version of the measure that was developed, at the end of the interview, we also showed the measure to parents and we walked through it with them and we asked questions about, how well do you understand these items? Is there anything confusing here? And is your child's experience really reflected in the measure? And so the goal here is really support for content validity. And this means we're asking the right questions in the right way. We're not missing anything, important components of communication. And we're making sure that we're doing this in a way that's going to get us the most valid information about this child's experience. And just like Dr. Fraser said, we're following the patient-focused drug development guidances. The snapshot that just popped up on the screen is draft guidance 3, which is all about developing, modifying assessments for clinical trials. I don't know why the animation isn't working here, but let me see if I can. Well, we'll just move forward. So the reason that this project has been really successful is because of our partnership with the different communities. And we've done that through Combined Brain, which is a consortium of patient advocacy organizations. There we go. And so for this project, we included 12 different neurodevelopmental disorders. You can see the first on this list is SYNGAP1. And the reason that we were so successful at recruiting into the qualitative work is really our community partners. So for each of the different genetic disorders, we had an advocacy organization. So huge thank you to SRF, to Mike, to Callie, to Corey, to everyone who's really participated to guide this work and help give us connections into your communities. All right, so now the fun part, which is actual results. So we have completed 115 interviews with parents across the 12 included neurodevelopmental disorders. 12 of those parents were SYNGAP parents. We also talked to 9 clinical experts who work with children like yours and children who have these other diagnoses, some of whom were speech and language pathologists. We also talked to some special education teachers as well as medical doctors. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the results from your specific sample. We talked to 12 parents of individuals with SYNGAP1 related intellectual disability. You can see on the slide, we have some descriptive statistics. Parents were on average around 40 years old. We talked to 10 mothers as well as 2 fathers. In terms of race and ethnicity, we had 9 caregivers identify as white, 2 as African American Black, 1 as Asian, and 4 as Hispanic or Latino. Most parents said they were married or living with a domestic partner, and we had relatively high rates of education. You can see here that almost half of our sample had at least some postgraduate education. In terms of who they talked about, we had a nice split in terms of female and male children. Like we heard before in talks today, almost all of them had a co-diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, and all of the children had epilepsy. We also had a really high rate of high-tech devices that were used to communicate with 9 out of the 12. And in terms of a screening question around verbal language, you can see here we had 6 children who did not use words at all according to their parents. Now, one of our goals was really to, describe the variability in communication, which we know is very different depending on the child, their age, their medical situation, the family situation. And so here is some quotes around expressive communication, specifically around how children made requests. These are all caregivers talking about their child with SYNGAP1. And you can see that the ways that children communicate are very, very different. So this first quote has a child who is bringing the parent something that they need help with. In the second quote, we have a child who is using word approximations to make a request. And then finally, we have a quote that a caregiver is talking about a child using their assistive device in a pretty sophisticated way. This child is combining symbols, navigating different pages. So in terms of the sample of caregivers from this community, we really saw all of the different modalities in terms of expressive communication. In terms of receptive communication, so this is what children are understanding from their communication partner. We had parents talking about their children following familiar directions, understanding isolated words or phrases, as well as making choices. You can see here this quote of the parent talking about how much the child understands and how that child shows them that they understand what the parent is talking about. In terms of social communication, we had caregivers talk about, greeting, saying hello, saying goodbye, using names of special individuals in the child's life. And again, we saw lots of variability in how children were communicating these things, including words, word approximations, gestures, signs, and assistive devices. Now, this is probably not groundbreaking to the parents in the room, right, who communicate and interact with your children every day. But one of the most important things about this is this clear, detailed description about how children are communicating, what they're communicating about, because we cannot measure something without describing it and defining it. Another interesting piece was the variable nature of communication. So you can see here, I apologize for how much text is on this slide, but we had a number of parents talk about the differences in the day-to-day communication observations that they have with their children. Some days more communication, some days less, some regressions, sometimes when skills, are not present, and sometimes when they come back. And one of the things that parents also talked about, which is related to this variable nature of communication, which obviously impacts how we would measure communication, is medical impacts. And so these are all examples from caregivers in this community. The first two on the left-hand side are quotations about adjusting medications and communication changes, both positive and negative, depending on adding and stopping medications that they observed. Unsurprisingly, I'm sure also to this community is the impact that seizures had on communication. So you can see here some quotes from parents describing what they have observed with their children when they had, more seizures versus less. I know we're on a fast timeline, and I hate to move forward when I know there's a lot of text on the slide, but I am going to keep moving. All right. One of the things that I also wanted to talk about with this group is, a theme that came up in conversations around frustration due to the child's inability or challenges with communication. Now, this came up across the 115 interviews. It came up organically, so that we didn't actually ask about frustration and challenging behaviors specifically in terms of our interview guide. We did not have a standard probe that we asked every parent. So over the 115 interviews, we heard 24 parents talk about this, but 7 of those were in the sample for this community. And so I think that's really salient that this was top of mind to parents. They mentioned this as something that was really impactful. So you can see here these 3 example quotes showing, how hard this is for the child and also on the family when they can't communicate, when they have something to say. Now, I will say that just because the other parents in this sample did not talk about this, it doesn't mean it's not relevant to them. Just meant it was really front of mind to these 7 parents who did talk about it. All right, last few slides for me. We had, the initial cognitive testing, which just means we showed them the existing version of the ORCA measure, and we asked how they felt it was working. And so across the whole sample of caregivers, it took about 14 minutes to complete. And in terms of how easy or hard it was to answer, we had 6 caregivers of children with SYNGAP-related intellectual disability who said it was very easy to answer, and 6 caregivers who said it was somewhat easy. That generally aligned with rates in the larger sample as well. In terms of how well the current version did at capturing their child's communication, we had 6 caregivers who said very well and 6 caregivers who said fairly well. And so where do we go from here? We have all this data. We have, data from 12 caregivers of children with SYNGAP1. We have 115 total caregiver interviews. And I think one of the things that we're working on is how do we improve this measure so that it is more appropriate, so that we're pushing folks from the fairly well at capturing their child's communication into that very well category. So next steps, we have, just over 2 years left on this project. You can see all the things we want to do in the blue boxes on the left-hand side. We are here. So what we are working on right now is taking all of that qualitative data and deciding what modifications we need to make to the existing version, what questions we need to add, what examples might help make things more clear to parents, and how do we make sure that we're better capturing every child's communication. Then we're going to be doing some more qualitative interviews with caregivers, as well as a translatability review, knowing that rare and ultra rare conditions, we really want to have an international perspective. And we want to make sure that the way we're writing the questions is not going to cause trouble when we go to translate it later on in the future. Then at the end, we're going to do a quantitative psychometric study, which you've heard some folks talk about today, looking at aspects of validity and reliability using statistical techniques. And then at the end, we'll have a modified version and some recommendations on how it can best be used in clinical trials. And so we're estimating this project in particular will end sometime in 2026. And so we are, moving along, but I think this also shows you the pace that sometimes it takes to move measurement science forward, and the detail and the care that it takes to make sure we're asking the right questions in the right way. While we're moving as quickly as possible, because I know the clinical trials are also moving as quickly as possible. All right, I am just one cog in this large wheel, so really want to thank my team, thank Combined Brain, really thank SRF and this community and all of the caregivers who generously participated in sharing their experience with their children. So thank you very much.
Okay.